All right, we are ready. We're a little bit early tonight. Go ahead and get started. Now take your Bibles and turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 9. We'll eventually get there. So we're continuing our study out of the book by Jerry Bridges of Trusting God Even When Things Hurt, even when life hurts. So tonight we are in chapter 6, God's Power Over Nature. So just one thing. I want to keep looking behind me. Look back there. See what's all right, our theme verse for tonight comes from Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 22 says, "Are there any among the idols of the nations that can cause rain, or can the heavens or the skies give showers? Are you not he, O Lord our God? Therefore we will wait for you, since you have made all these." So declaration that God has power over nature. Now yesterday, got some of the news, I think it was yesterday, our country surpassed 500,000 COVID deaths. Now, I'm not here to debate about the COVID stuff or whether you think all of those are actual COVID deaths, whatever. That's not the point. But as you think about a tragedy like that, whether it's from COVID or an earthquake or a typhoon or whatever it may be, somebody would ask, why did that happen? And somebody might say something like, well, God was just judging all those people. Well, I don't think that's a warranted conclusion that you can make. But one thing that is theologically correct is that God is the one that was in control of that. And that's what we've been studying here. Why he allowed it to happen is a question that we can't answer, and we shouldn't try to. But we can say on the testimony of the scriptures that God did indeed allow or cause it to happen. So let's look at several different areas concerning nature. First of all, understand that God controls the weather. All of us are affected by weather every day. There's weather. Sometimes it's good weather, sometimes it's bad weather, but there's weather every single day. Now, sometimes bad weather is just an inconvenience to us. The first time that I actually came to Green Bay was several years before I came up here to candidate. My niece was getting married up in Pembine. And so we were flying from Greenville, South Carolina, up to Green Bay, and then driving up the rest of the way, or my brother was picking me up or somebody. And so we had a flight that was leaving out of Greenville. Greenville usually, depending on what airline you're going on, either goes to Atlanta or goes to Charlotte, and then goes wherever you're going. So it's not a major hub. So I think we were flying through Atlanta to Chicago and then to Green Bay. Well, our flight was at 6 o'clock in the morning. So we had to get there at 5 o'clock in the morning. So we had to leave our house because we were an hour away from the airport. So we had to leave like at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock, whatever it was. And so we get there and our flight gets delayed because there's bad weather in Chicago. And so we wait around till about 8 o'clock. The next flight that was leaving, still flights weren't leaving out of Chicago. So they bumped us to the next flight. Well, long story, longer. About 4 o'clock, it was 4 or 5 o'clock, the last flight was coming in that could then turn around and go back to Atlanta. And we see it pulling us, okay, maybe we can get on this one. And we're looking at it out the window as it's coming up to a park. And the pilots have the windows open. There's smoke rolling out. And I told my wife, we're not getting on that plane. I don't care what they say. I'm not getting on that one. And so we spent all day there. And at 6 o'clock, they send us home and say, come back tomorrow and try again. And we've all had experiences, something like that, somewhere along the way where weather has inconvenienced us. But other times, some people somewhere are drastically affected. Whether it's a tornado that wipes out a town, or a drought or hailstorm that wipes out all the crops of a farmer, or a typhoon that comes in and 300,000 people are drowned, whatever it is. We've seen these things. Has anybody experienced a major weather-affected tragedy? Have you actually been in one? Okay. What was yours?
Earthquakes in California.
Earthquake, yeah. Those things, I'm sure I've never experienced one, so I can't imagine how sharing a 3. Okay, yeah. And people die in those?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Larry?
Earthquake in Italy.
In Italy.
People died.
Yeah. Jessica, I see
I had a
you.
tornado, but thankfully nobody died. So
Oh.
yeah,
But-
a lot of my good friends' houses were just completely destroyed. So.
Yeah. And so these things affect us. And don't we sometimes tend to regard it as nothing more than just impersonal expressions of fixed meteorological or geological laws that are taking place? Well, it just happened. The weather just happened. And, oh man, I was unlucky to get caught at the airport when all of this was going on. And even Christians, sometimes we tend to live like and think like deists, where a deist believes that God created everything, but then just set his laws in motion, just stand back and just let it run. And sometimes we tend to think that way. God's just, letting the weather do whatever it does, and earthquakes happen and whatever. But what we have to understand is that God has not walked away from the day-to-day control of his creation. Now, God has established physical laws of nature that are in place, but those laws are continually operated according to God's sovereign will. There was a Christian meteorologist who studied the Bible, and he found 1,400 references to weather or natural disaster type things in the Bible. 1,400. That's amazing. So we're going to look at all 1,400 of those tonight. So we get a full picture. No, we're not going to do that. But let's look at 5 passages here. So we want to volunteer to look one of these up and read them for us. Need volunteer, okay? You got number 1, Larry number 2, Kevin number 3. Need a couple more. Richard number 4. Need one more. All right, Teddy number 5. If you look those up, and then we'll have you read them out loud. Listen for the weather or geological things that are involved in these verses, and also the sovereignty of God involved in them. Okay, Job 37, 3 and 6.
He sends it forth under the whole heaven,
his lightning to the ends of the earth. In verse 6, for he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength.
All right, so there it mentions lightning, snow, gentle rain, and heavy rain, all being under the control of God. All right, Job 37, 10 through 13.
For yet a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Yes, yea, thou shalt diligently consider the
I don't
place.
think that's the right.
Job, what psalm? Oh, sorry.
Job 37,
10.
10 through 13, yes.
By the breath of God, frost is given, and the breath of the waters is straightened. Also by watering he wearieth the thick cloud, he scattereth his bright cloud, and turned round about by his counsel, that they may do whatsoever he commandeth them upon the face of the world and the earth. He causeth it to come, whether for correction, or for his land, or for mercy.
Okay, so there it shows some of the causes. There in the last verse says sometimes it's for correction, sometimes it's for the land, and sometimes it's for God's mercy upon his people. Very interesting. Psalm 147.
He giveth snow like wool, he scattereth the hoarfrost like ashes. He casteth forth his ice like morsels. Who can stand before his cold? He sendeth out his word, and melteth them. He causeth his wind to blow, and the waters flow.
And in all those, we see that God is causing all of those weather things to happen. All right, Jeremiah 10:13.
When he utters his voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasuries.
So God is taking credit for everything that's happening as far as weather is concerned. And then Amos 4:7. Yes, Ted.
I also withheld rain from you when there were still 3 months to the harvest. I made it rain on one city and withheld rain from another city. One part was rained upon, and where it did not rain, the part withered.
Yeah, God, they're using it to bless some and to curse others. In control of the weather. So note that all of these scriptures attribute all expressions of weather, whether they were good or bad, to the direct controlling hand of God. We mentioned this before. Insurance companies, when they refer to natural disasters, call them what?
Acts of God.
Acts of God. And surprisingly, they have it right. They are acts of God. The only thing they ever got right, but they have that right. The truth is, all expressions of nature, all occurrence of weather, whether it be a devastating tornado or a gentle rain in a spring day, they are all acts of God. So the Bible teaches that God controls all the forces of nature, both the destructive or productive, on a continuous moment-by-moment basis. It's not just when he has something he needs to do in Jason's life over here, but every moment of every day, God is in control of the weather and the geological forces, like earthquakes and so forth. He is always in control. Therefore, true believers should never refer to ourselves as victims of the power of nature. We're not victims. God is in control of what's happening in our life in particular. One professor, G.C. Berkauer, said this: the believer is never the victim of the powers of nature or fate. Chance is eliminated. In our lives as believers, there's no such thing as chance. Now I'm going to do a little meddling here, the next section. Complaining or Thanksgiving? Isn't complaining about the weather like a national American pastime? If you don't have anything else to talk about, you complain about the weather. and we've got to be careful as Christians that we don't get caught up into that, because it's really an ungodly habit when we understand what we're understanding tonight. When we complain about the weather, aren't we actually complaining against God who sent the weather? And how does God feel about people complaining? Well, look back in Exodus when the people of Israel were going through the desert and they complained that they didn't have water and they didn't have flesh to eat. It says in Numbers 11:1, now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. I think God takes complaining pretty seriously when we're complaining against him. I think we categorize that as a sin against God. So we also deprive ourselves when we complain. We deprive ourselves of the peace that comes from recognizing that our Heavenly Father has it all under control. Instead of complaining about the weather, I'm just, well, God has a reason for it to snow today, or the sun to shine today, or a tornado to come today. And we have that peace that God is in control. So whether the weather merely disrupts our convenience or destroys our home, we need to learn to see God's sovereign and loving hand in everything that takes place. Now, the fact is, for most of us, the weather and the effects of nature are usually favorable. We usually have good weather, or at least it's not hindering us or being inconvenient to us. Bad weather is really the exception. But isn't that what sticks out in our mind? If you think about last year, you might be able to think of some bad weather days. But do you remember any of the good days, when the sun was shining? It's sort of like the news. The news emphasize, they hardly put any good news on there except for one little spot at the end. They have some, what do they call those?
Public service announcement.
Almost a public
Bubblegum
service.
report.
Yeah, some little feel-good story at the end. The whole rest of the news is the bad news that's happened, and that just seems to be human nature to focus on bad news. Well, the same thing when we think about weather. Sometimes we often think about the bad weather, and we tend to take the good weather for granted. But Jesus said this. Jesus even referred to weather when he was here on earth. In Matthew 5:45, he said, he's referring to his Father, God. He says, he makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So though God sometimes uses the weather and other expressions of nature as an instrument of judgment, we've seen that, he can do that, he most often uses it as an expression of his grace and his mercy to us. He does send the rain. He does bring the sunshine on all of us, whether we're good or bad. And that's an expression of God's gracious provision. Jesus said that these are acts of God. So, now, remember, feel free to slip in any thoughts or ideas as we go, because I get going and I just blabber. Okay.
Pastor,
Yes.
in Philippians 2:14, do all things without murmuring or disputing.
Yeah. Including talking about the weather.
Easier said than done.
Yes. We know we all have weaknesses. Yeah, Jason.
I walked into the office yesterday and a bunch of people have their windows wide open at the shop. I'm like, why do you have the windows wide open? They're like, it's gorgeous outside. It's like 40 degrees. I'm like, okay, this is all relative. If it hit 40 degrees in June, you were going to complain up a storm. I said, but it's been below zero for a month.
Yeah.
Now it's warm. So it is funny how fickle we can be and how we think something's great when maybe it's.
Yeah, and Pastor Aaron mentioned our staff meeting today. He opened up all the windows in his house yesterday, just let the fresh air in, because it was, 40 degrees in February. That doesn't usually happen. How many of us thanked God for that good weather? Or did we just say, well, it's just something that happens?
Just take it for granted.
Yeah, we take it for granted. So,
A friend of my dad's, this is where I would go. He joined the fire department in Green Bay in January. His first fire call was a grass fire.
Yeah,
Yeah, so.
weather can be fickle as well. But it's God that's bringing all of that about. So Alexander Carson said this: the sun and the rain minister to the nourishment and comfort equally of the righteous and the wicked, not from the necessity of general laws, but from the immediate providence of him who in the government of the world wills this result. So yes, God does have laws, but things don't happen just because he's got the laws in place. They happen because it's part of his sovereign will for each one of us. So we need to learn to stop complaining about the weather and to be thankful for it, whatever it may be on a particular day or a particular time. One of the songs we have in our hymn book called Day by Day, a couple of lines says, he whose heart is kind beyond all measure gives unto each day what he deems best. So whatever he deems for our weather to be, he thinks it's best. Whether it's a 45 day in the middle of February or there's 15 below, that's what he deemed was best for us that day. Let's expand this a little bit and talk about natural disasters. All of us are aware because they make the headlines of the large-scale natural disasters that happen. There's been many of them in our lifetime that we've seen. From year to year, there's always some types of disasters where thousands of people are killed, or others just slowly are starving to death because of the disaster that's taken place to their food chain and so forth. So why does God allow all of this? Why does God permit all those innocent children to starve to death? Now, it's not wrong for us to wrestle with those things because we're humans. As long as we don't do it in an irreverent or unsubmissive attitude toward God. I think if we fail to wrestle with that, I think we lack compassion in our hearts. You know, I hope your heart is touched with it and you don't just, okay, there's another typhoon in Bangladesh, another 300,000. That doesn't affect my life. Well, if you're human, it ought to affect your heart. And we ought to think about those things. However, we've got to be careful not to, in our minds, one, take God off of his sovereign throne, because he is in control, nor to put him in our courtroom and bring him before our bar of judgment. God, you don't know what you're doing. You've done something wrong here. We don't have a right to do that either. So when we see a disaster on the news, I don't know about you, sometimes as I see a disaster take place and I see like a tornado hits and wipes out a town, and you see people sifting through the remains of their house that they've lived in all their life. And sometimes I want, what would I say to that person if he's a believer? What would I say to them if I was their pastor and I had to minister to them? All of us are supposed to be ministering to one another. What do you say to somebody like that? And what is interesting is sometimes, I know I've tended to do this in the past, is I try to make excuses for God. That this disaster happened. But understand that in the scriptures, God takes full responsibility for all these events. Look at this verse, Isaiah 45 and verse 7. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity or disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. He not only accepts responsibility, he claims responsibility for all these disasters.
Pastor,
Yeah.
I was thinking there about that about 10 minutes ago when you were talking about rejoicing in the weather, and that just kind of exactly what you just said, with the tornado, if it would wipe out someone's house, how would you rejoice in the weather if you're dealing with those circumstances?
Excellent question. It's one thing when you see somebody else sifting through the rubble. How about when it's your house and it's your rubble? How are you going to respond to that? Well, that's what this book is all about. We respond by trusting God. We may not understand why he did what he did. We may never understand this side of it. Sometimes we get an answer, but not always. And that's where it comes down to, do we really trust and believe God that all things are going to work together for good? Even a tornado wiping out my house, God had a purpose in allowing that to happen. And I'm going to trust it. So we must allow the Bible to say what it says, that God is in control, that God is the one that caused that, and not try to make the Bible to say what we think it ought to say about God. Jason?
When you think about the joy that surpasses understanding, and that, I won't say me, because you sound kind of puffed up when you say, well, if I was going through that, I would, I'd have the spiritual joy through the whole moment. That sounds a little, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would. But the power of the testimony of those people that have been through that we've seen, and how God uses that in a miraculous way that I don't think you could preach 1,000 sermons without the same impact of one act of true submission to the Lord's will, and having a peace about, okay, this is going to work out, it's going to work out, and we'll see how God does with it.
And understand there's a big difference between joy and happiness. Joy is what God sustains you on the inside because you trust him. You know that he's in control. Happiness depends on happenings, circumstances. Joy is based on where your faith is. Yes.
I think it's also almost impossible to ask the Lord why with the right attitude. So when people use the word or ask the question like why, wonder what they expect, because you know how we responded when our 5-year-old kept saying why.
Yeah.
Well, and why did you know?
Because I said so. Right.
It's impossible to keep it right.
And so our attitude is important.
Absolutely.
when we ask God things.
Pastor, I don't want to delve into if you're going into this, but Job and his wife, after he lost everything, he says to her, so shall we not receive good and also bad from the Lord?
Exactly. And tying into what Brother Fizz was saying, Romans chapter 9 talks about who are we to question God? And we have to trust him.
Just so you know, I did not know Job.
Oh, okay. So we obviously do not understand why God creates disasters, or why he brings it on one town and not another. Or as you see, I had an uncle in Marion, Indiana, and back in the 60s, a tornado went through Marion, Indiana, and went right down their street and hit every other house. It went boom, 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 missed their house, but got the one across the street, the one across the street over there, and it just, why? We don't know. Just as God sends his sun and rain on both the righteous and unrighteous, he also sends the tornado, the hurricane, the earthquake on both. So God's sovereignty over nature does not mean that whatever we experience at the hand of the weather or other forces, are all circumstances are under the watch. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Let me back up. God's sovereignty over nature does not mean that whatever we experience at the hand of the weather or other forces, all circumstances are under the watchful eye and sovereign control of God. Another area is physical afflictions, sickness, pain. Is God in control of diseases and physical infirmities that affect us? Birth defects, cancer, someone that's in chronic pain. Is God in control of that? He says he is. Remember when God came to Moses on the backside of the desert and was calling him to go deliver the people, and Moses made an excuse. What was his excuse?
I can't speak.
Yeah, I can't speak. I'm slow of speech. I got a tangled tongue, whatever. And he probably did really have that. He wasn't just making excuses. He really had that. And God's response was this, Exodus 4:11. So the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? And although he was directly dealing with Moses's mouth, God's taking responsibility for all of these infirmities upon people, deafness and blindness and muteness and so forth. These physical afflictions are not merely the products of a defective gene, but they are the result of God's sovereign hand in each person's life. Dr. Donald Gray Barnhouse said, no person in this world was ever blind that God had not planned for him to be blind. No person was ever deaf in this world that God had not planned for that person to be deaf, and so forth. If you do not believe that, you have a strange God who has a universe which has gone out of gear and he cannot control it. It's one or the other. And so we've got to trust our God. Look at your text here that I had to turn to at the beginning, John chapter 9. And here is a passage in the life of Christ. It says in verse 1, now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? See, that was what the theologians of the day were saying. The reason that you have any kind of defect is because either you sinned or your parents sinned, and God's judging you because of that. Now, when Jesus answers and says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, he wasn't saying that they were sinless people. He's saying that isn't the cause. What was the cause? That this man was born blind. He's a grown man now. So all of these years, say 40 years, he's been blind and has suffered that. What did Jesus say? But that the works of God should be revealed in him. So basically, Jesus is saying it wasn't a birth defect. It wasn't a judgment of God. It was so that God could be glorified through him. At this moment in time, as Jesus is passing by and this blind man is there, it wasn't by chance that Jesus was passing by that he could heal this man. And we've got it recorded in scriptures, and we're still glorifying God 2,000 years later of what Jesus Christ was able to do. So none of these afflictions just happened. It was just bad luck, bad genes, or whatever. So the question then actually comes to us, so why does a sovereign God who loves us allow us, his kids, his children? Why does he allow us to have pain and suffering and heartache in our life?
Is it possible sometimes that God would say, well, when something bad happens, he goes, okay, I didn't do that, you did it.
But he's taking credit and saying that he did it. Now, understand as we back up a little bit, that in God's original creation, it did not contain pain and suffering and heartache. That wasn't a part of his original plan, his creation.
Are you sure? Because now I'm gonna bring this up, going back a few weeks to the sovereign will of God.
I'm sure, because that's the way he created it. That was not a part of his creation.
But he knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, he knows everything.
Yeah.
He knew it was going to happen, but it was not a part of his original creation. He created perfect environment, perfect man with no sin, no sorrow, no death, no pain, no suffering. Now,
Sometimes, Pastor, people forget that the cross was not plan B.
Yeah.
It was the original plan.
yes, yeah,
Well,
God planned all of these things before his creation, but when he created, he did not create this world with pain and suffering. What caused the pain and suffering?
Man, sin.
Man's sin, the fall. Not only for us, but for the whole creation. Romans chapter 8 says, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now. So the ultimate cause of all pain and suffering must be traced back to the fall. But God allowed the fall. God's good and his bad are not arbitrary and capricious, but they're part of his determined response to sin. And that's what we have to understand, that many of the things that are going on that God does through weather and nature and whatever is his determined response to the sin that mankind brought into this world. So the sovereign God who subjected creation to futility still rules over it, pain and all, suffering and all. He's still in control. Now, there are deep theological issues about pain and suffering, and that's not the purpose of this study. Maybe because I have no idea. But our purpose is, in the midst of that pain and suffering, that we all have seen that God is the one that allows it and causes it. Our purpose is to deal on the level of trusting in God. If we believe that God is in control, do we then trust him when he allows pain into our life, whatever it may be? What do you think God's doing? We don't always know. A lot of times, he's trying to build our faith. Paul mentioned about the sufferings of today are little compared to the glory that is to follow. Let's look at one other area that's kind of in this general genre, and that is childlessness. Many couples pray for years without any results of children being born into their marriage. And here again, the Bible consistently affirms that God is the one in control of that. Hannah, we know the story of Hannah and Samuel and her husband, Elkanah. 1 Samuel 1:5 says, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. Okay. There specifically, God's taking credit for that he's the one that closed her womb. Now, later on in the story, we know that he's the one that opened her womb too, and she had a child. That's not always the case. Genesis 29:31. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Again, God in control. So, God not only controls the conception, but really God even controls the details of what DNA is going to be passed from the mother and the father to form us into what we became. It wasn't just chance. God controlled that. Psalm 139 verse 13 says, for you, God, formed my inward parts, and you covered me in my mother's womb. He was in control down to the very DNA strands that we have in our bodies. He controlled that. How then can we trust God in the midst of pain, of affliction or disease or heartache or barrenness? Back in chapter 1, we laid down this premise that we're going to trust God. There's 3 things that we've got to believe. One, we've got to believe that God is in control of all things. And we've got to believe that God is perfect in his love and that he's infinite in his wisdom. Now, we haven't gotten into those other 2 yet. We'll get to those later on in the study. But those are the things that are going to sustain us during troubles and trials and pain and suffering. That we believe that God is in control. But that he is a loving God. He's perfect in his love. He wouldn't allow this in our life if he didn't know it was for our best. And that he's infinite in his wisdom and that he does know what is best. Notice this these verses from Lamentations. It says, "For the Lord will not cast off forever, though he causes grief, yet he will show compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men." In other words, it's not just, he just causes pain just for the sake of causing pain. That's what that means when it talks there about he does not afflict willingly. No, he has a purpose. And he has a sovereign will. And he has an ultimate end that he's going toward. And we are a part of it. Jerry Bridges, the writer of the book, he said this: God does not willingly bring affliction or grief to us. He does not delight in causing us to experience pain or heartache. He always has a purpose for the grief he brings or allows to come into our lives. Most often, we do not know what that purpose is, but it is enough to know that his infinite wisdom and perfect love have determined that that particular sorrow is best for us. And then notice the statement. I underlined this in my book when I was reading it. It says, God never wastes pain.
Mm-hmm.
For him, think on that. God never wastes pain. And his purpose is for his glory. He always uses it to accomplish his purpose. And his purpose is for his glory and our good. Therefore, we can trust him when our hearts are aching or our bodies are racked with pain. He does have a purpose. Now, kind of back up, somebody had mentioned this earlier. Trusting God in the midst of our pain and heartache means that we accept it from him. And there's a difference between the acceptance of what God is doing and just being resigned to it or submitting to it. We can resign ourselves to a difficult situation simply because we don't see any other alternative. So, well, nothing I can do about it. And so we just resign to it. Or we can submit to the sovereignty of God in our circumstances with a certain amount of reluctance. But where God wants us to get to is a full acceptance of that pain and suffering into our lives. And that has a connotation of a willingness. Lord, I'm willing for you to give me cancer. I'm willing for you to make me childless. Lord, I'm willing for you to destroy my house with a tornado. If that's what's going to be best. And I trust that you know what is best. An attitude of acceptance says that we trust God. We trust that he loves us, and we trust that he knows what is best. Now, acceptance does not mean that we do not pray. But we're supposed to be praying. We ought to pray. If we have pain, there's nothing wrong with praying that God would heal us. God desires us to do that. Or to pray for the conception of a birth of a baby into our family. We should pray in a trusting way. And though God can do all things, we understand that he is infinitely wise, and for loving reasons, he might not answer our prayer the way that we've been praying. And that's where that trust factor comes in. We pray, and then we accept whatever God answers us with. Now, how do we know how long to pray for something?
So you get an answer.
What if you don't get one?
Keep praying.
Keep praying. Story of George Mueller. He prayed for a man for 35 years to get saved. And he
His
got
brother.
saved at George Mueller's funeral. 35 years.
Yep.
Isn't that how Glenn Bender's dad got saved also? I might be getting that confused. Linda, maybe it was Linda Van
Linda
Leeshow.
Van Leeshow led him to the Lord.
Was that the situation? But it was at someone's funeral, right?
No, it's Christmas. I think it was Christmas Eve.
Okay, but they prayed for him for a long time.
Yes.
So as long as we can pray trustingly in God and with an attitude of acceptance of whatever his will is going to be, then we continue praying until God gives an answer or until we no longer have a desire for that. Sometimes God just removes the desire for
Sometimes
whatever it
it's
was that we're
about
praying for. Pardon?
It's about 10 minutes. But I've often come to the conclusion, if God allowed everything to just be peachy keen and beautiful, what would we need God for? If he gave us everything we need, well, okay, see you next week, God. Although there's a lot of Christians who do that don't spend as much time as they should.
Think about a doctor who spends 4 years of undergrad, then 4 years of medical school, then 4 years more of an internship, and then maybe he specializes, spends all that money and all that time, but nobody ever got sick. He's wasted his skills and time. Now, as we said, God isn't just capricious in the way he passes out pain and misery and disaster. He has a purpose in all these things, yes.
The way that God has spoke to me about this relationship, pain versus trusting the Lord. Is I played basketball in high school, and there was one particular kid though. My basketball coach pushed the hardest, and he continued to push him. Like, do your layup, do it harder. Do your layup, do it harder, even harder than that. And to take that picture, to take that story, and you ask the question, well, what's the significance of why his coach pushed this boy harder? Well, he was his son, and pushing him harder. I guess the son has two choices. He either can, stiff arm him and say, you know what, you don't know anything. I'm gonna forget what you have to say, or embrace it. And so, the difficult challenge is not easy. He was the best player on our basketball team, so it's not easy to become successful, but it's hard work, and he wanted the best for him, so he pushed him harder. As a layman or as a Christian, you think of Hebrews, and the Lord disciplines those he loves. And then you see James 1, it just talks about count out joy, my brother, count out joy for your trials, for the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. You see all that, and then you think about the working of your salvation is the process that God is putting you through. And you just think of all these elements of how basketball is basically a training so you can be successful in the game. Well, God is preparing you for hardships to be successful in the kingdom of heaven. And his goal for us is to be like him and to be, in many ways, godly and holy and righteous. And what great picture is that? And we look at that as saying, great, that's wonderful, but it's not for me. It's essentially what you're saying if you're just going to stiff arm God when it comes to those trial moments. So think about that picture of basketball and how hard it can be. But you know what? If you embrace it, you have wonderful things coming for you.
One of the things that I observed early on in ministry was that the men that I saw in ministry that really impacted my life, and I thought God was really using. When you read their life story or heard something, every single one of them had a great tragedy in their life that was molding and made them into the man of God that they were. And it's not just true for preachers, but that was my circle, and and the guys that really, I thought God was really using, when you got to talk with them or read their life story, there was a major tragedy. My pastor that I was growing up under, they lost a child at 2 years old. Just a major impact, but it was amazing how from that point forward, God just greatly used Tom Malone in the ministry. Others, Dr. Bob Jones Sr., they had a similar tragedy like that, lost a child or a teenager or a child somewhere along the way. And so God knows what it takes to mold us into what's going to be beautiful in his sight. Yeah, just
The really comforting thing about the father example is, unlike our earthly fathers who may have good motives and reasons, they're flawed. They have their own, there may be ego involved. There may be reasons they're pushing that aren't all godly.
Right.
But with God, they are all godly.
Right.
And we don't have to be concerned about, where's this lead if God gets his will. And sometimes I think we think, oh, it's kind of like the kids getting worried about, becoming missionaries and getting sent to the bush of Africa. Don't think those thoughts. Know that he has what is going to make you happy in the joy way worked out in his will.
Yeah, with his infinite wisdom, he really does know what's best and know how it's going to work out. And, we've got to trust that, even when things are going wrong. Habakkuk, minor prophet. The prophets were always preaching to people that were in rebellion, and most of them didn't listen. And in the midst of all the struggles and the evil that he saw around him, he had a question, where is God in all of this? And his conclusion was this in Habakkuk chapter 3. He said, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no fruit, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, everything going bad, what was his conclusion? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will joy in the God of my salvation.
Amen.
He was settled. He could see everything that was going on around him. And he mentions it. He's going to rejoice in the Lord and have his joy there. And that's what we've got to do. I don't know what struggles you're going through. I don't know what this year has ahead of us. Somebody in this room could have a major catastrophe this year. But we all have to trust God. That he's in control. He's the one that's going to bring it. And that he loves us in bringing it. And he knows what he's doing. He's infinitely wisdom. And that's where trusting God has to take place. Yes.
I think of the story of Jacob going from Esau when he was fleeing to Esau, going to his uncle's place, and when he rested and he slept. In the time when he wrestled with God. That element of just, imagine, of course, wrestling with God as being silly, but his struggling with God and whatever he was struggling with, and in the end, all he had to do was just touch his hip, and he was out. But there was still in that wrestling though, it's mercy. There's mercy because he could have just touched the hip right away, but he didn't. He allowed that to happen. He allowed the struggling to occur because then, in a way, I don't really know what it does to the person, but in a way, it's God's mercy to give you opportunity to turn to Him, to trust Him, and to, that's why I see continually. Even that's why He hasn't come to this earth yet. And you read in, I forget where I read it just recently, but He hasn't come to this earth yet because He has mercy. He's giving because he's waiting for those to come to the Lord. You know, like that's why he hasn't come yet. Like you just see that picture and you just weep in tears. Like you're waiting for me to even be more holy. Like it's giving him. I don't know. It's a great picture of we have a long story of why Lord I didn't come yet. Oh, come for me, Kyle. God, it's for me. Come on, it's for me. Versus nope, I have a bigger picture for my world more than Kyle. Like you know, so I don't know. It's humbling.
To me, the real question, the world asks, how can God allow pain and suffering? And the real question is, how can a holy God allow joy and happiness when we've all sinned against him?
Yeah.
So all of that is God's mercy spread upon believers and unbelievers. Any amount of joy, anything better than hell is the grace of God in anybody's life.
Amen.
And we many times take the goodness of God for granted, but he's in control in the good times and the bad, and that's for our good and his glory. All right, any other comments? See that, John?
Jason was talking about, you've all heard things, boy, when I have kids, I'm never gonna say that to my kids. And then guess what? Oh, my dad, or something, you know, and the things that your parents did for you raising you. And you didn't understand it and didn't realize what was going on until you had your own children. Oh, that's what my dad meant, or something, you know.
Yeah, and our lives are, especially us fathers, we represent God to our children in many ways. And we're supposed to reflect that. Thank you. Yes.
I read, Jerry Bridges had a little book called Trusting God, like a synopsis of the book. And Jerry lost his wife to cancer. So I was reading it just when my first wife was died of cancer. So kind of it brought it home.
Right. It's real. Life is real for all of us, but our God is real as well. All right, anything else?
Well, and again, First Peter talks about the element of just the trials that we encounter in our life. You know, the responses you have from are either going to be production of gold or they're going to be wasteful. You know, and they're going to be burned up. You know, so I guess the ultimate question is what's your foundation, people? What's your foundation? You know, and who are you going to build upon, and who are you going to trust upon? Who are you going to continue to build that story of the glory of the Lord on? Are you going to build it upon yourself? And that's going to be waste. You know, are you going to, is it be precious metal? You know, I guess the question is when it burns up, the only thing that tests in fire is things that give glory to the Lord.
Right. The world's T-shirt is, he who ends with the most toys wins. And that's not it. That's not it.
And then he who dies with the most toys still dies.
That's right. And after that is the judgment, as the Bible says. All right, very good. Well, I know Awanas is over, and so the Awana commander's down here looking for y'all. Thank y'all for coming.
Hi, how are you?
It's,
Tired.
yeah, it's about my nap time. This time yesterday, I was already sitting in the recliner. I got almost 7 hours of sleep in the recliner last night.
Oh my word.
Got up, brushed my teeth, and went to bed.
Another 7 hours?
No.